Imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time to any period in human history. You could choose to witness the building of the Egyptian pyramids, meet Leonardo da Vinci during the Renaissance, or perhaps watch the first man walk on the moon. But there's one specific year that all historians agree you should avoid at all costs. A year so terrible, so filled with calamities and suffering, that even historical records of the time describe it as the end of time. That year is 536 AD, and today we'll discover why it was considered the worst year to be alive in all of human history. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our videos on fascinating history. And let us know in the comments what time you're watching this video. Let's see if we have any late night or early morning subscribers here on the channel. Our journey begins with a phenomenon that modern scientists were only able to fully explain. A few decades ago, in 536, something extraordinary and terrifying happened to the sky itself. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the sun simply can no longer shine properly. The Byzantine historian Procopius of Caesarea, one of the most reliable sources of the time, wrote that the sun gave dull light, like the moon, throughout that year. He described how there were no shadows of men at noon, and that the sun's heat was so weak that people could not warm themselves even in direct sunlight. But Procopius was not alone in his observations. On the other side of the world, Chinese chroniclers recorded that the sun was blue and dim, so dark that the stars were visible during the day. In Europe, Irish chroniclers documented that there was no summer that year, and that famine spread throughout the known lands. What all these observers were witnessing was something modern science has identified as a volcanic winter, caused by one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Scientists believe the eruption occurred somewhere between Indonesia and the Philippines, possibly from Krakatoa or another massive volcanic system in the region. The eruption was so powerful that it spewed millions of tons of ash, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the stratosphere, creating a global curtain that blocked sunlight for months. Imagine the magnitude of this eruption. It was estimated to be 3 times more powerful than the 1815 Tambora eruption, which caused the famous year without a summer of 1816. The immediate impact was devastating. Global temperatures dropped between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius, which may not seem like much, but it was enough to cause widespread crop failures around the world. In Europe, temperatures were the lowest in 2,300 years. Trees stopped growing, as evidenced by the extremely thin growth rings found on trunks from the period. In China, snow fell in midsummer. In the southern hemisphere, ice formed in regions where it would normally never occur. But climate problems were only the beginning of the horrors of 536. Plunging temperatures and a lack of adequate sunlight devastated global agriculture. Seeds failed to germinate, the plants that managed to grow were weak and sickly, and the crops that survived produced miserably low yields. At a time when the vast majority of the world's population depended directly on agriculture for their survival, this meant a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. In Europe, the situation quickly became desperate. Chroniclers of the time described people eating tree bark, grass, and anything else they could find to fill their stomachs. In some regions, disturbing reports suggest that some people resorted to cannibalism to survive. Grain reserves that would normally last until the next harvest were quickly depleted, and there was no prospect of a successful harvest again. The Byzantine Empire, then one of the most powerful and prosperous civilizations in the world, was particularly hard hit. Emperor Justinian I, who had dreamed of restoring the glory of the ancient Roman Empire, saw his grandiose plans crumble in the face of the climate and food crises. Byzantine cities, which depended on grain imports from Egypt and other provinces, began to experience mass famine when these regions were also affected by crop failures. But if you think famine was the worst of 536's problems, you're mistaken. As if the climate apocalypse weren't enough, nature had more horrors in store for that cursed year. The conditions created by the volcanic winter created the perfect environment for the proliferation of diseases. Widespread malnutrition weakened the immune systems of populations around the world, making them extremely vulnerable to epidemics. And that's exactly what happened. Although Justinian's Great Plague technically began in 541, many historians believe its origins can be traced back to conditions created in 536. The combination of famine, forced migration of populations in search of food, and the collapse of urban sanitation systems created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. But it wasn't just the future plague that plagued the people of 536. Other diseases, including dysentery, typhus, and various fevers, spread rapidly among the weakened populations. Medical records from the time are limited, but the surviving accounts paint a horrific picture of widespread suffering. Entire families were wiped out by disease, entire communities disappeared, and the dead were sometimes so numerous that there weren't enough healthy people to bury them properly. The situation became even more desperate when we consider the economic impact of these calamities. Trade, the backbone of the medieval economy, virtually collapsed. Trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa became dangerous not only due to adverse weather conditions, but also due to the breakdown of social order in many regions. Bandits and looters took advantage of the chaos to attack trade caravans, making travel even more risky. Coins from the period tell a fascinating story about the economic impact of 536. Modern analysis of Byzantine coins show a dramatic decline in the quality and quantity of gold and silver used in coinage, indicating a severe economic crisis. The empire simply no longer had the resources necessary to maintain its monetary standards, a clear sign of the extent to which the economy had been devastated by the events of that year. But perhaps even more striking is how 536 affected the political and social development of civilizations at the time. In Europe, many historians argue that the events of 536 marked the true beginning of the Dark Ages. Established political systems began to fragment under the pressure of multiple crises. Kings and emperors who had ruled with absolute authority found their power useless against the forces of nature. In Britain, already experiencing a period of instability following the Roman withdrawal, 536 was devastating. The Arthurian legends may have their roots in this period, with some historians suggesting that stories of a heroic king attempting to unite Britain in times of chaos may reflect real-life attempts by local leaders to maintain order during and after the crisis of 536. In France, which at the time was divided into several Frankish kingdoms, records show that 536 was a year of heightened conflict. Resource scarcity forced different groups to compete violently for arable land and food supplies. This led to an even greater fragmentation of political power, establishing patterns of conflict that would last for centuries. On the other side of the world, China was also severely affected. The Northern Wei dynasty, which ruled much of northern China, faced widespread peasant revolts when the harvests failed. Chinese records from the time describe crowds of starving people marching toward the cities, only to find that the urban granaries were also empty. The emperor was forced to open the imperial treasuries to purchase grain from distant regions that had been less affected. But even this was not enough to alleviate the widespread suffering. One of the most fascinating things about 536 is how different cultures around the world interpreted these events. Without modern scientific knowledge to explain what was happening, people resorted to religious and superstitious explanations. In Christian Europe, many saw the events as a sign of the apocalypse, a divine punishment for humanity's sins. Some chroniclers wrote that the end of time had arrived, and that Christ would soon return to judge the living and the dead. In the Islamic world, which was just beginning to form at this time, the events were interpreted through similar religious lenses. In China, the events were seen as a loss of the mandate of heaven. The traditional Chinese belief that rulers only retain legitimacy while they have divine approval. This led to questions about imperial authority and contributed to the political instability of the time. But perhaps the most interesting interpretations come from cultures that left oral rather than written records. Many tribes around the world have legends that may date back to this period. Stories of a time when the sun disappeared, when winter lasted for years, and when evil spirits walked the earth. These stories, passed down from generation to generation, may be echoes of the collective traumas experienced during 536. The long-term effects of 536 were perhaps even more significant than the immediate impacts. The demographic crisis caused by famine and disease had consequences that lasted generations. Entire populations were decimated, and it took decades for population numbers to recover in many regions. This had profound impacts on the economic, political, and cultural development of these societies. In Europe, many argue that 536 marked the true end of classical antiquity and the beginning of a period of decline that would last for centuries. Cities, which had been centers of commerce and culture, shrank dramatically. Many were completely abandoned, leaving only ruins as testament to their former glory. Knowledge was lost as libraries were abandoned, and scholars died without passing on their learning. The impact on technology and innovation was also significant. At a time when society was struggling simply to survive, there was little time or resources to devote to developing new technologies. Many agricultural and artisanal techniques were lost. When the people who knew them died during crises, this contributed to the technological decline that characterized much of the Dark Ages. But not everything about 536 was negative in the long run. Societies that survived the crises were forced to adapt and innovate. New forms of social organization emerged, many of which would become defining features of medieval Europe. The feudal system, for example, may have its roots in the adaptations necessary to survive crises like that of 536. Agriculture was also forced to adapt. Surviving farmers developed more resilient and diverse farming techniques. They learned the importance of maintaining larger food reserves and diversifying their crops to reduce the risk of total crop failure. These lessons were passed on to future generations and helped medieval societies become more resilient to future crises. From a religious perspective, 536 had profound and lasting impacts. In Europe, the crisis strengthened the power of the Christian Church as people sought spiritual comfort in the face of incomprehensible suffering. The Church became not only a source of spiritual guidance, but also one of the few institutions capable of providing practical assistance during the crisis. Monasteries became food distribution centers, makeshift hospitals, and shelters for the displaced. This consolidation of religious power would have lasting consequences for the development of European civilization. The Church emerged from 536 more powerful and influential than ever before, establishing a pattern of religious authority that would endure for centuries. The events of 536 were often cited by later religious leaders as evidence of the necessity of faith and obedience in times of crisis. One of the most striking things about 536 is how modern scientific evidence has confirmed and expanded upon historical accounts of the time. For decades, some historians were skeptical about the extent of the calamities described in ancient records, suspecting they might have been exaggerated. However, recent scientific research has not only confirmed the reality of the events, but also revealed that they may have been even worse than the records suggest. Analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show clear evidence of a major volcanic eruption around 536, with sulfur deposits corresponding exactly to the period described in the historical record. Tree ring studies from around the world confirm severely limited growth during 536 and several years thereafter. Even analysis of lake sediments show evidence of extreme weather conditions during this period. Perhaps even more fascinating, ancient DNA studies are beginning to reveal the true demographic impact of 536. Genetic analysis of modern European populations show evidence of severe population bottlenecks occurring around this time, suggesting that populations were reduced to a fraction of their previous sizes. This confirms that the crisis of 536 was not just a temporary calamity, but an event that literally changed the genetic makeup of entire populations. Archaeologists have also found physical evidence of the desperate conditions of 536. Excavations at urban sites show evidence of sudden abandonment around this time. with houses and buildings left in conditions suggesting rapid escape. Refused deposits from the period show evidence of people eating materials that would not normally be considered food, confirming reports of extreme famine. But what makes 536 even more terrifying to contemplate is that it wasn't an isolated event. Evidence suggests that the volcanic eruption's climatic effects lasted for several years, with 537 and 538 also being unusually cold and harsh years. This means that populations that survived the initial impact of 536 had to endure additional years of harsh conditions, making recovery even more difficult. And then, as if the universe wanted to ensure this period would be remembered as the most terrible in history, came the Great Plague of Justinian in 541. This pandemic, which many historians consider the first truly global pandemic in history, killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, about 13 to 26% of the world's population. At the time, although it technically began 5 years after 536, many believe that the conditions created by the crisis of 536 set the stage for this additional catastrophe. The plague spread along trade routes that were slowly being re-established after the crisis of 536. Ironically, society's efforts to recover from the volcanic catastrophe may have inadvertently facilitated the spread of the disease. Populations already weakened by the famine and trauma of the previous years were particularly vulnerable to the new threat. The psychological impact of living through 536 and its subsequent years must have been unimaginable. Imagine being an ordinary person at that time, watching the sky darken, crops fail, loved ones die of starvation and disease, and having no scientific explanation for what was happening. For many, it must have felt literally like the end of the world. The few surviving personal records from this time paint a picture of profound despair. Letters between family members, separated by the crisis, describe a feeling of living in a never-ending nightmare. Poems from the period speak of a world transformed into a place of shadows, where hope became a luxury few could afford. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of 536 is not how terrible it was, but the fact that humanity survived. Despite all the calamities, despite famine, disease, social and climate collapse, our species persisted. The societies that survived the crisis emerged different, often tougher, but also more adaptable and resilient. The lessons of 536 resonate today, at a time when we face our own climate and environmental crises. The story of this terrible year serves as a reminder of both the fragility and resilience of human civilization. It shows us that even the most severe catastrophes can be survived, but it also warns us of how quickly our familiar world can be transformed into something unrecognizable. Modern scientists study 536 not just as a historical curiosity, but as an example of how massive volcanic events can affect the global climate. With our current understanding of climate systems, we know that a similar eruption today would have even more devastating consequences for our globalized and interconnected civilization. Imagine if a volcanic eruption of the magnitude of the one that occurred in 536 happened today. Our global agriculture, which depends on stable and predictable climate conditions, would be devastated. Our transportation systems, which rely on fossil fuels and complex infrastructure, could collapse. Our globalized economy, based on just-in-time supply chains, would be severely disrupted. But we also have advantages that the people of 536 didn't have. We have the scientific knowledge to understand what's happening. We have the technology to communicate instantly around the world. We have more sophisticated food storage and distribution systems. We have modern medicine to combat disease. The question is whether these advantages would be enough to protect us from a catastrophe of the magnitude of 536. When we look back on that terrible year of 536, we are reminded of the importance of humility in the face of the forces of nature. We are reminded that our civilization, however advanced it may seem, is still vulnerable to events beyond our control. But we are also reminded of the incredible human capacity to survive, adapt, and rebuild even in the face of the most extreme adversity. The people who lived through 536 didn't know they were experiencing what historians would later call the worst year in history. They simply woke up each day and did what was necessary to survive another day. They cared for their families, helped their neighbors when possible, and kept alive the hope that things would get better. And eventually, things improved. The sun began to shine normally again. Crops began to grow again. Populations slowly recovered. New societies emerged from the ashes of the old. Life continued, as it always does, even after the worst catastrophes. Today, as we face our own challenges and uncertainties, perhaps we can find inspiration in the resilience of those people of 536. They showed us that no matter how dark the sky becomes, no matter how impossible the situation seems, humanity has a remarkable capacity to persevere. The story of 536 is ultimately a story about the strength of the human spirit. It's a story about how, even in the worst year to be alive, people found ways to keep living. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can learn from this dark chapter in our history, that no matter what the future holds, we have within us the ability to face any challenge and eventually emerge stronger on the other side. But our story about 536 cannot end here, because there are even more fascinating and disturbing aspects of this year that we need to explore. When we talk about the worst year in history, we're not just discussing numbers or cold statistics. We're talking about millions of individual human lives, each with their own personal tragedies, their own moments of despair, and occasionally hope. Let me tell you about some of the most striking accounts that have survived from this period. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster record that in 536 there was a failure of bread throughout the land. But behind this simple phrase lies a terrible reality. Archaeological excavations in ancient Irish settlements reveal evidence of entire families being found dead in their homes, apparently having starved to death where they sat. There was not even the energy to go out and seek help. In Scandinavia, already a region of brutal winters, 536 brought conditions that even the hardy Vikings could not endure. Later sagas speak of an endless winter when the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned Midgard. Analysis of archaeological sites shows that many farms were simply abandoned during this period, with families leaving behind all their belongings in the desperate hope of finding better conditions elsewhere. What makes these accounts even more poignant is that we can see, through archaeological evidence, the final moments of these people. In an excavation in present-day Denmark, archaeologists found the remains of a family who had gathered all their valuable possessions in a single room, apparently waiting for someone to rescue them. They died waiting for help that never arrived. But perhaps even more disturbing is what happened in the great cities of the time. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire and one of the largest cities in the world, with over 500,000 inhabitants, was transformed into an urban nightmare. The Byzantine historian John of Ephesus described crowds of starving people wandering the streets, like living ghosts, their clothes in tatters, their faces drawn by malnutrition. Byzantine authorities attempted to maintain order by distributing minimal bread rations, but these measures were completely inadequate given the magnitude of the crisis. Contemporary accounts describe lines of desperate people stretching for miles through the city streets, waiting for a small sliver of black bread made from whatever grains could still be found. Many people died in the queues themselves, their bodies simply pushed aside so the line could move on. What makes this situation even more desperate is that Constantinople had, until then, been one of the most prosperous and well-supplied cities in the world. Its markets were always brimming with exotic spices, precious silks, and foodstuffs from all over the empire. Within months, these same markets had become bleak places where people traded the last remnants of their possessions for scraps of food. Emperor Justinian, who had dreamed of reconquering the entire former Roman Empire, was forced to abandon his grandiose plans and focus entirely on the survival of his people. Surviving administrative documents show how the Byzantine government was forced to implement increasingly desperate emergency measures. They confiscated grain from private estates, implemented strict rationing, and even began to melt down imperial treasuries to purchase food from foreign merchants, who charged exorbitant prices. But even these measures were not enough. The situation became so desperate that the emperor himself was forced to open the imperial palaces to shelter starving refugees. Imagine the irony: the most powerful man in the world sharing his luxurious quarters with ragged peasants who had nowhere to sleep. It was a complete reversal of the social order that no one could have imagined. In France, the situation was equally dire, but with different nuances. Gregory of Tours, one of the leading chroniclers of the period, describes how Frankish nobles were reduced to begging for the same food as their serfs. The social hierarchy that had defined medieval society began to disintegrate as both lords and peasants faced the same existential threat of famine. One of the most moving stories comes from a monastery in present-day France, where the monks meticulously recorded how they were forced to sell all the sacred objects of their church, including golden chalices and precious relics, to buy grain to feed the refugees seeking shelter in their lands. These men, who had dedicated their lives to spiritual service, discovered that Christian charity demanded material sacrifices that tested the very limits of their faith. But what is perhaps even more striking is how 536 affected not only humans, but the entire natural world. Records from the time describe how animals themselves seemed disoriented by the anomalous conditions. Migratory birds lost their normal flight patterns, some never returning to their traditional routes. Domestic animals, especially cattle and horses, died in massive numbers, not only from starvation, but apparently from respiratory diseases caused by the volcanic particles in the air. Modern paleontological studies confirm these ancient accounts. Analysis of animal bones from this period shows evidence of severe malnutrition and respiratory disease on a scale unparalleled in any other period of medieval history. Even predators like wolves, which are normally resilient to environmental changes, showed signs of severe nutritional stress. The oceans were also dramatically affected. Fishing records from the time show that many fish species simply disappeared from their usual areas, likely due to changes in water temperature and ocean currents caused by the volcanic winter. Coastal communities that depended on fishing for their livelihoods found that even this reliable food source had been compromised. In post-Roman Britain, the situation was complicated by additional political issues. The island was already fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms at war with one another, and the crisis of 536 intensified these conflicts. As resources became scarce, war became a matter of literal survival. Welsh chronicles of the time describe battles not for territory or honor, but simply for control of grain fields or herds of cattle. It's interesting to note how different cultures interpreted these events through their own cultural and religious lenses. In Christian Europe, many saw the catastrophe as divine punishment, but there was disagreement about what exactly had provoked God's wrath. Some blamed the moral decay of the cities. Others saw it as punishment for the persistence of pagan practices. There were even religious movements that preached that the end of times had arrived, and that the faithful should prepare for the final judgment. In the pagan Germanic world, the events were interpreted through Norse mythology. Some later sagas preserve echoes of how people of the time saw 536 as the beginning of Ragnarok, the prophetic end of the world where even the gods would die. The idea of an endless winter preceding the end of the world may have its roots in the actual experiences of 536. In China, the interpretation was very different, but equally profound. The Chinese saw the events as evidence that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. This led not only to peasant revolts, but also to an existential crisis among the ruling class. If heaven itself was rebelling against the emperor, what was the purpose of the traditional social order? This issue had profound and lasting consequences. Many historians argue that the events of 536 contributed to fundamental changes in Chinese political philosophy, strengthening the idea that rulers should be judged by their ability to protect and feed their people, not simply by their hereditary right to rule. In India, which at the time was divided among several Hindu kingdoms, the events were interpreted through the lens of Hindu cosmology. Some saw 536 as evidence that the world had entered Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and decay that precedes cosmic renewal. This interpretation had profound implications for how people lived their lives, with many turning to ascetic practices in hopes of escaping global suffering. But perhaps the most fascinating records come from cultures that lacked written traditions, but preserved memories of 536 through oral tradition. Many Native American tribes have legends about a year without a summer, when evil spirits blotted out the sun. These stories, passed down from generation to generation for over 1,000 years, preserve surprisingly accurate details about anomalous weather conditions. In Australia, some Aboriginal traditions speak of a time when the sky became sick and the sun forgot how to shine. Tree-ring analysis of Australian eucalyptus trees confirm that 536 was a year of unusually low growth, suggesting that even this distant continent was affected by the volcanic winter. One of the most striking discoveries in modern research on 536 comes from ancient DNA studies. Geneticists have been able to trace how different populations were affected by analyzing the genetic diversity of skeletons from the period. The results are striking. Many local populations were reduced to just a few surviving families. In some regions of Europe, genetic diversity declined so much that it took centuries to recover. This gives us a new perspective on the true magnitude of the catastrophe. We're not just talking about economic hardship or temporary famine. We're talking about an event that literally changed the genetic makeup of entire populations, an impact that can still be detected in people's DNA today. Even more fascinating is how 536 affected language development. Linguists studying the evolution of European languages have found evidence that many significant linguistic changes occurred around this period. As populations were decimated and mixed due to forced migration, their languages also mixed and changed. Some words and grammatical constructions we use today may have their origins in the linguistic adaptations required during and after 536. Art and culture were also profoundly affected. Analysis of artistic artifacts from the period reveals a dramatic shift in style and subject matter. Art before 536 often celebrated abundance, military strength, and prosperity. Later art became darker, focusing more on themes of suffering, salvation, and spiritual transcendence. In architecture, similar changes can be observed. Buildings constructed before 536 tended to be grand and ostentatious. After 536, there was a shift toward more practical and defensible structures. People learned that beauty was less important than functionality when it came to survival. Medicine was also transformed by the events of 536. Physicians of the time were forced to deal with types of diseases and conditions they had never seen before. Mass malnutrition created new medical challenges, and the few surviving medical texts from the period revealed desperate attempts to find treatments for conditions caused by starvation and prolonged exposure. Ironically, some of these desperate medical discoveries turned out to be beneficial in the long run. Doctors learned more about nutrition and the treatment of hunger-related illnesses than had been known before. They also developed new methods for preserving medicinal herbs and preparing medicines with limited resources. The impact of 536 on education and knowledge was equally profound. Many schools and centers of learning were closed as teachers and students died or were forced to flee. Libraries were abandoned or their books were burned by desperate people seeking fuel for warmth. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was lost in a matter of months. But paradoxically, 536 also led to some positive developments in the preservation of knowledge. Monasteries, which until then had been primarily centers of worship, began to function as crucial repositories of knowledge. Monks copied and preserved texts not only for religious reasons, but because they recognized that knowledge itself had become precious and fragile. Agricultural technology was also forced to evolve rapidly. Farmers who survived 536 had to develop new farming methods that were more resilient to adverse weather conditions. They learned to diversify their crops, improve food storage methods, and develop more efficient irrigation techniques. Some of these agricultural innovations became permanent. Features of medieval agriculture. The crop rotation system, for example, may have been refined in response to lessons learned during 536. Farmers learned that relying on a single crop was extremely risky, and they began planting a wider variety of crops to reduce the risk of starvation. International trade was also permanently altered by 536. Pre-crisis trade routes were disrupted, and when trade finally recovered, it followed different patterns. Merchants learned the importance of diversifying their cargo and establishing emergency depots along their routes. Interestingly, 536 may also have contributed to some important technological developments. The desperate need for heat led to improvements in heating and building technology. The need to preserve food led to advances in preservation techniques. The need to communicate across long distances in times of crisis led to improvements in communication systems. But perhaps the most lasting impact of 536 was psychological and cultural. The societies that survived the crisis were fundamentally changed by the experience. They became more cautious, more focused on emergency preparedness, and more aware of their vulnerability to natural forces. This shift in mindset can be seen in many aspects of later medieval culture. Medieval art frequently features themes of mortality and the fragility of human life. Medieval literature is full of stories of heroes facing seemingly impossible odds. Medieval religion placed a strong emphasis on preparedness for catastrophes and the importance of spiritual salvation. When we look at medieval Europe, with its defensive walls, its carefully maintained stockpiles, and its hierarchical but pragmatic social organization, we are seeing a civilization that was shaped by the memory of 536. People did not forget the lessons of that terrible year, and they built their societies with those lessons in mind. Thus ends our profound journey through the most terrifying year in human history, a year that teaches us about the fragility of civilization, but also about the indomitable strength of the human spirit, a year we wish had never existed, but which, paradoxically, helps us better appreciate the world we live in today and reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, humanity finds ways to persevere, adapt, and eventually thrive. Again,